This is our third lesson in this particular series in the Federalist, and we're actually going to start with the first of the Federalists that was written, that Alexander Hamilton wrote. So the first two sessions were try to introduce the subject and get us to where we could start with these. And there's 85 of the Federalists, and we're not going to cover all 85 of them. That you can kind of group them together. This many cover this subject, this many, and so on. So we're going to do a brief overview of them. So we're not going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, right on through to 85. That would take us a while. But I am going to be reading some from Federalist 1 tonight as we get into where we're headed. And with that said, here's the way Federalist 1 starts. After an unequivocal experience of the inefficiency of the subsisting federal government, you are called upon to deliberate on a new constitution for the United States of America. The subject speaks to its own importance. What assumption does Hamilton make in that introductory statement? What's something that he's assuming and that he states as a fact there that not everybody agreed on it at the time, and that's the reason they had such a hard time getting it ratified, was one of the reasons. What does he say? He starts out and says, after an unequivocal experience of the inefficiency of the subsisting federal government. In other words, he's saying what we have is not working. To put it another way, it's not working. Well, not everybody agreed it was not working. If they had of, then it'd been a lot easier to gotten the Constitution ratified. But he starts off with that as an assumption as he's beginning to introduce what he's going to be talking about here in this first of the Federalists. Here he continues, comprehending in its consequences nothing less than the existence of the Union, the safety and welfare of the parts of which it is composed, the fate of an empire. He says the fate of an empire, in many respects, the most interesting in the world. So he's saying the very fate of our country as it existed depends on them ratifying this Constitution. Again, not everybody agreed with that at that particular time. I talked about that last time when we were talking about the anti-federalists that were against it, including Patrick Henry, among many others that did not agree with the Constitution, did not want it ratified. That's even like going back to the Revolutionary War. When we read the history of our Revolutionary War that started with it back in 1775. We assumed that everybody back then agreed with the war. Well, they didn't. There was a lot that did not. The battles that occurred in North Carolina, some of them did not have any British troops involved. It was the loyalists to the government and the patriots were fighting each other. So it was American fighting American at times. So it was not a foregone conclusion. And that's the reason that the Federalists were written and put in the paper, is to convince the people of New York that, look, you need to ratify this thing. And he's saying the fate of the empire is at stake here. Federalist number 1. He says, whether societies of men are real. Now listen, I want you to listen to the way he's framing this. But over the question of whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, or whether they are forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. Now, what was he saying? What's he opening up with here? That's fairly close to the beginning of this. He's saying, he's questioning the ability, do men really have the ability to make a constitution, to form a reasonable government? Is that something we're capable of doing, or will you just leave it to chance? Is that what we need to do? Leave it to chance, or can we do something about it? So his first thought was, Are we even capable of doing this that we are set about doing? He proceeds to show that many people oppose the Constitution if it benefits them to not ratify the Constitution, if they feel like they're better off served by if they're kind of prejudiced towards the Articles of Confederation, they wouldn't be. That some of the opposition is because they thought they would lose something. Many of the states thought that they would lose too much of their power if they formed a federal government. You have to remember that when they had framed the Constitution, and the Constitution that they were talking about ratifying, we had these states that were loosely joined together, and this Constitution was something to try to hold them together, but each state wanted to hold on to their little bit of power. But the Constitution does not take power away from the states. Slowly over the years, the federal government has taken over part of the authority that the states should have had. And it's a lot, and I think I mentioned this the last time, and a lot of times it comes down to money. The federal government will tell you what you can teach in your schools, and the reason they can do that is because they say, well, if you don't teach this, then we're going to pull your federal funding. Well, if we never took the federal funding, we wouldn't be in that position, and we could teach what we wanted to. But that's beside the point. But he said, if they benefit from the current system, they're not going to want to ratify this Constitution. Was it reasonable to think that men were capable of establishing a good government? And then what government had the world experienced up to this point? So what were they working from? What were they familiar with? And so I wanted to go back and look at a couple of governments to get us to where I want to land tonight. Japan. They were established circa 660 BC until today. The current form of government is unitary, parliamentary, constitutional monarchy. Now, we're not going to discuss the ins and outs of that, but it's basically a parliamentary style government, but it's still considered under a monarchy. Look when it says the current Constitution was formed and ratified. 1947. When was ours? 1787. This 1747, what had just ended in that this would come about? The Second World War. So they had to come up with the Constitution in order to, this is one of the things that they had to do in order to revive their country and get it started back. It's so interesting to me, irritating I should say, how people talk about how horrible the United States has been and how we're terrible colonizers and what we've done. We sent people over and money over to rebuild Japan. We did the same thing with Germany. We beat them both. And we had, there's other people in the fight with us. We beat them both. But we sent people over to rebuild this nation that we had conquered. We didn't keep them as a colony. We helped them rebuild. Didn't ask for anything in return. But their constitution is in 1947, a long time after ours. Japan was founded in 660 BC because it was the year of Emperor Jimmu. Now, he, according, you can see what I've got here, he was descended from the sun goddess. He was born to the sun goddess, and all other emperors up until that time and up until today have descended from the sun goddess, whose son is Jimmu, according to their traditions. And so the kind of government they had at this time, this particular time, was a monarchy. It was ruled by the emperor. What the emperor said goes. In 1185 to 1868, which is after our Constitution, the country was ruled by shoguns. Did anybody ever watch the back in, what was that, 70s Shogun? Basically, it was whatever military power was the strongest. They were the ones that ruled at that particular time. They were the rulers over it. In 1868, they returned to imperial rule, back to the rule of the emperor. In the Meiji Constitution of 1889. And so their system, it was considered the first parliamentary government in Asia. So back before our Constitution, They were under a monarchy. Ancient Rome, year established and ended circa 753 BC to 1453 AD. Don't go home and look that up and say those dates are wrong, because people argue over exactly when it started and when it ended. So that's not what I'm trying to point out here. Current form of government, modern day Italy is a unitary parliamentary constitutional republic. When was their constitution? 1946. That's a little while after ours. But up until that time, in fact, you go back to 509 to 1453 AD, it became a republic. But look what it says here, the caveat under this. You got to vote. Anybody could vote as long as you were part of the ruling class, as long as you were a landowner, as long as you were of one of the patricians, they call them, you got to vote. But if you weren't, you didn't get to vote. So that meant the mass majority of people did not vote, did not get to vote, period. They were common people. Ancient Greece, 1100 BC, 600 AD. The current form of government is unitary parliamentary republic. Current constitution, 1975 in Greece. Now, ancient Greece, of course, was back before then. Greece is credited with starting a democracy. But again, it was a democracy, but not like we experience today in our constitutional republic. Some say democratic republic, whatever how you want to phrase that. But it was not like it is today. At the time, and I put a note here to remind myself, as much as anything, you all can read that. If I'm going to read something, I like having it up here because it's better to see something than it is just to be read something. They were under at the time of the Federalist, when this was written and when the Constitution was formed, they were under the control of the Ottoman Empire. What was the Ottoman Empire? They were Muslims. They were Muslims. They ruled Turkey, Greece, all the way around into the Middle East. They've ruled a huge swath of countryside over there. So at the time of our Constitution, they were under the Ottoman Empire, so they didn't have any right to vote, any constitutional form of government, anything to go with. And here's the question. How much experience did any of the founders or the citizens of the USA have in making governments? How much experience did they have in it? They were born under the monarchy, under the parliamentary monarchy that they were in. They were born into that, and so were their parents and the parents before them in most cases. So they didn't have any experience in creating a government. Now think about that. Just let that sink in for a minute. When they sat down to form this Constitution, they had no experience in what they were doing, really. It was all new to them as well. Monarchies they were familiar with, nations the world over were familiar with monarchies. Most every country in Europe at that time was a monarchy. It was ruled by a monarch to some degree. Not as in England, it was a parliamentary monarchy. So, but if the king said something, it pretty well went. But they had the parliament, so they could have some say in what was being said there. He addresses imagined critics who would question his willingness to listen to other arguments because he'd already made up his mind to support the Constitution. That's another reason that I said why he and Madison and Jay wrote under the pen name of Publius. They didn't want anybody to know who they were because they would know they're already prejudiced in one way or the other. He insists that while his motives for urging ratification of the Constitution are personal, he remained receptive to the best arguments. So Alexander Hamilton is saying, I'm open to these arguments of what they had to say. Well, if you read much about Alexander Hamilton, he was a brilliant man, but once he made up his mind, it's pretty hard to get him to change in another direction. But still, he was making the argument here. Finally, he outlines specific issues that he will address in the Federalist Papers. Here they are. Political prosperity and the Constitution, the inadequacy of the present government to preserve the Union, the necessity of a strong and energetic government, the Constitution and its relationship to Republican principles of government. Let me ask you, why did we need a Constitution? Back up a little bit. Since I've been here, we put together a Constitution and bylaws for this church. Why did we do that? It's the same reason. Well, think about this. With Israel, God gave Moses a, quote, constitution. He gave him certain things that they were to do, no matter how many kings you went through, no matter how many governments you went through, still your ruling authority is the Constitution, what we call Mosaic law. That's the ruling Constitution. Our Constitution, the reason it's good to have a good, strong Constitution is because all of Congress, President, Supreme Court, all the courts, everybody, your final authority is the Constitution. If it doesn't fit within the Constitution, you can't do it. Well, I wish more of our elected officials and our judges understood that more perfectly, because it establishes some truth, some basic principles that are always there that never change. There's some things that just don't need to change. And it's the reason our Constitution, it takes a supermajority, if you will, in order to amend it, because you don't need to be able to change it easily. If you could change it easily, what would happen in Washington every time they changed power? It would be, we would have no foundation whatsoever. And that's what he was talking about here. The necessity of a strong and energetic government, the Constitution and its relationship to the Republican principles of the government. So these are the things that he outlines that he wants to do. He's hoping they can accomplish in their arguments in favor of ratifying the Constitution in the Federalist, or what many people refer to as the Federalist Papers, what they've come to be referred to as the Federalist Papers. In that he is writing to the people of New York, he points out the similarity of the proposed Constitution to New York's Constitution. See, there were states that had constitutions at the time that they were ratifying or establishing, writing, putting together our Constitution and ratifying. There were already states that had state constitutions, and they drew from some of these to get some of what they had in our national Constitution. So he's saying, look, some of you states, like we're here in New York, a lot of what's in this Constitution is very similar to the Constitution that you approved and passed here in your own state, in the state of New York. So he wants to point that out. I'm going to conclude the first section of the Federalist by telling the people that it might seem unnecessary to plead for a strong union. Indeed, it may even seem as though the country was too large to establish a national system of government. He said, and that's what some of their argument was. They were saying the weaknesses of, and I'm going to put this next. Anyway, the argument was the weakness of a Republican form of government is that it works well in governing a small country, a small group of people, but not a large country like what we're talking about here. What was the background of the political theory of the educated men in the United States at this time period? In other words, these men that had come together, what was their educational background? What was their background on political theory? What did they have to look at? What did they have to govern what they were doing? Most educated men, especially those who were at the heart of governing the new country, were extremely familiar with the republics of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. If you go back and look at the discussions that they had about the Constitution when they were putting it together, they talked about ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and their republican system that they had put in place. But remember, the republican system that they did is not like the one that they're forming here, because only the upper class were able to vote. Only they were the ones that had, in other words, you had equal rights under the republican forms of government in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. I put them together, I said ancient Greece. But the difference was everybody was equal, but there are some people a lot more equal than others. You didn't get to vote if you didn't have land. And so it was, although they had these to look at as an example, they didn't have anything that could really form their thinking in a way to educate them in how to form this Constitution. But they did have some understanding of republics at this particular time. And the primary fear was what I talked about before, about the country being, because the country is so large, this republican form of government will not work in a large country. Here's the large country that they had. This in pink is what the country consisted of when they were talking about this. And they were saying it was too large for a constitution to work, or not a constitution, for a republican form of government to work. And you'll see that, you see how much longer these are, because this naturally became Tennessee, this became Kentucky, Mississippi, Alabama, and they're divided up differently. But at the time of the forming of the Constitution, this is the way they were. Maine, you see, was part of Massachusetts. There was not a separate state. So this is the place, this was the size of the big country that they thought that the Republican form of government wouldn't work well in. They were thinking this was big. Can you see, and this is off the subject, you see right here this part called Louisiana. You remember the Louisiana Purchase that was done under Thomas Jefferson, and we bought it from the French owned it at that particular time, and we bought it. Look at what it added to the country when they bought that section of land. It just about doubled the size of it. But this was all there was, and this is what they were talking about. It was too big to be governed by a Republican form of government. Anyway, was that a legitimate argument? No. Conventional wisdom was that this problem had always been the downfall of republics. For instance, the fall of the Roman Empire. The other major pitfall of republics had been class warfare. What kind of government would end class warfare? What kind of government will end class warfare? Is there ever going to be a time when everybody in any country, anywhere, is exactly equal? It can't be. But they want to level things out and make them more equal. So let's look at some suggestions. Communism. Read this definition. Political and economic doctrine that aims to replace private property and a profit-based economy with public ownership and communal control of at least the major means of production. For instance, mines, mills, factories, and the natural resources of society. Okay, now, think about this just a second. You replace private property and profit-based economy with public ownership. How is the public going to own everything? How is, in communist governments, this is what they say. They say everybody here is equal and everybody owns this. Do they? What happens? You have a small group of people that tell you that this is not yours, you can't own it, but you really do own it. All of you own it together, but you can't do anything with it unless we tell you you can. So will communism do away with class warfare? Did it? Has it over the years? Listen, how would this be better? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, they're endowed with their Creator, by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. This is in the Declaration of Independence. What's the difference between the Republican form of government that they're talking about and a communist form of government? What's the difference? The major difference to me that makes all the difference in the world is in our form of government, the individual who's most important. Under a communistic form of government, the collective is most important. In other words, you are not an individual. You're part of the collective. Hamilton also explains his motives and those of his cohorts, clarifying that this will not be a debate between two sides. In other words, he's saying these papers, he's introducing these articles that are going to be coming out that they call the Federalist or the Federalist Papers. He's introducing all these, and he said, well, this is not going to be a debate. We're telling you why you should ratify it. Plain and simple. That's what these papers are going to be about. So he's being upfront about them and telling them this is the way. We're not sitting here. We're not asking for debate here. The place for you to have debate is at your ratifying conventions. And they had them. They had fist fights, everything in the world you can think of in these ratifying conventions, trying to come up with a way or trying to decide if they were going to ratify this Constitution or if they were not. But he's telling them up front that this is not going to be a discussion in these articles. We're telling you why this Constitution is good for you and good for the country. In this article, therefore, the most important part of the outline Hamilton provides, enabling the reader to classify the remaining 84 papers with ease. In other words, he's telling you this is what we're going to do, this is the way to interpret it, and if you look at it from this standpoint, it'll help you understand these better. Hamilton outlines 6 key concepts discussed in the Federalist, and here they are. So you can memorize these for next week. The utility of the Union to posterity. The insufficiency of the existing Confederation to preserve the Union. We're going to talk about that. The necessity of a government as powerful as that proposed to meet this object. The conformity of the proposed Constitution with the true principles of Republican government. The Constitution's analogy to various state constitutions, which we already mentioned that. He said some of your state constitutions are already very much like this. The additional security of Constitution will provide to the preservation of government in those states and to the preservation of liberty and property. So this is what he's saying. These things is what this is what we're going to lay out in these arguments that we're presenting in favor of ratifying the Constitution. These are what we're going to cover. Let me read the quote here. The Federalist itself, Hamilton was, he was looking into the future, if you will, and he was part of his argument, and part of what he was saying was, this Constitution, this form of government that we're establishing is going to have an effect on the whole world for all of time. Has that happened? Got a quote here. The Federalist itself was published in Spanish in 1811 by the Venezuelan, if I could, that's a hard word to say, isn't it? Manuel Garcia de Sana, along with copies of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. In addition, the Federalist Papers influenced movements in Argentina, Mexico, Brazil, and Europe. It had this went worldwide, even way back then. It influenced governments and places all over the world. There's nothing that's been looked to more than the U.S. Constitution when countries are looking to form governments since it came about. Not only did Hamilton's predictions come true, but his very words were also influential far beyond the original 13 colonies. And here's the rest of that. Hamilton, perhaps more than any of the founders, believed in the future greatness of America. He believed that this nation, where was he born? Alexander Hamilton. He was living in New York when he wrote all this. He wasn't even born in the United States. He was not born in the colonies. He was born in, was it Barbados? It was in the Caribbean. That's where he was born. He never knew his father. He believed that this nation could be one of power and strength, and he believed that such power and strength, far from corrupting the nation's purpose or the rights of individuals, was necessary to realize the former and protect the latter. The very use of the word empire in this paper is very telling. Characteristically, he looks ahead. He dips into the future and sees the United States as a world power. Was the United States a world power when they ratified this Constitution? By no means. They weren't. Nobody in Europe considered them a world power, considered them much of anything except a little fledgling group of people trying to hold things together. This was in 1787. When did we go to war with Britain again? In 1812. And it wasn't many years later we wound up with war again with Britain. Did you all realize that during the War of 1812, they came in and burned the White House to the ground and captured Washington, D.C. and all the surrounding areas? Our nation could have fallen apart easily at that point, but it didn't. While this might seem odd to the modern reader, in 1788, America was extremely vulnerable to European conquest and domination. His vision for America is even more remarkable under these circumstances. Think about it. Spain was more powerful than the United States. France was more powerful than the United States. Britain was more powerful than the United States. And about everybody was more powerful than the United States. There was no power here at all. One of the things that protected us besides the divine mercy of God and protecting us here is we had something that we don't have today. And we still have them, but it's not the impediment that it was back then. It's called the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. We were protected. And now if you want to leave London and go to the United States, how long would it take you to go? It'd take you several hours. How long did it take back then? About a month. Give from one side. If you say, that's when they're coming up with peace treaties, you write out your peace treaty and you send it across the ocean. It'd take them a month to get there. Then they would read it and say, we disagree with this part. And so you get back on the ship and you go back this way. And then you come up, well, we'll do this. And then you get on the ship and you go back this way. And it was slow. But now how quick is it? You can pick up the telephone and talk to somebody in London. I don't have this. Maybe I should. On your phones, like Karen, my daughter Karen and her family, they all have these locators on their phones. Karen can pick up her phone and tell you where Charles is, where Karen is, where Luke is, where everybody is. She can pick up, just look at it on her phone. Well, I know where most time where Diana is. She's at the house with me. I can tell you where she is, so I don't have to track her. I don't have as many people to track. But think about that. We can track people that easily today. But back then, you didn't even know. Well, for instance, the War of 1812, they had already ended the war before the Battle of New Orleans ever took place. But the ship hadn't gotten back with the treaty saying, look, we quit, we give up. And so we had another major battle after that, which was good because we wound up with a property we wouldn't have. Things were different back then than they are today. So Hamilton is spelling out, and he puts that, if you want to read the first, you can look it up on the internet or how you want to. If you want to read the Federalist 1, it's a short read. It doesn't take long to read. But this is basically what he was trying to do, is he was trying to set up what they're going to be talking about in the following Federalist papers. Any questions?